Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, like the previous three programs, because this is the big story, this one too is about the US Zionist war of aggression against Iran. And I have with me, and normally I do my opening and then introduce the guest, but I am going to introduce him up front. So I have with me Dr. Vali Nasr, who's an Iranian American scholar who's also very well known in Pakistan. Dr. Nasr is the Majid Khadduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. By the way, the Middle Eastern Studies program was founded by Professor Khadduri, who passed away back in 2007. He was an Iraqi academic, international law expert, and also a diplomat. So Professor Nasr also served as the 8th Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS between 2012 and 2019, and also a senior advisor to U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, this is Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. That was from 2009 to 2011. His most recent work is Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. He is also the author, in fact, he's the author of multiple books, and some of those, The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in Retreat, Forces of Fortune, The Rise of a New Middle Class, and How It Will Change Our World, The Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future, Democracy in Iran, History and the Quest for Liberty, Islamic Leviathan, Islam and the Making of State Power. And then I think this was his doctoral thesis, Mawdudi and the Making of Islamic Revivalism, the Vanguard of Islamic Revolution, Jama'at-i of Pakistan. I remember reviewing this particular book, The Vanguard of Islamic Revolution, back in, I think, 96 for the Friday Times. He's also the co-author of How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare. So he's written numerous articles in scholarly journals, and his commentary regularly appears in Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, New York Times, Washington Post, and I mean, the list is really long. And as you can imagine, he's been swamped the past month, and by the looks of it, and Trump's trumpery, his plate is likely to remain full for the foreseeable future. Incidentally, just a trivia, trumpery is used as a noun, also as an adjective, and its first use, according to OED, was in 1456. It refers to worthless, rubbishy, or showy items that lack real value, as well as nonsense or deceitful talk. So now you know how prescient language can be and what one should make of Donald Trump when he speaks or posts stuff on Truth Social. Anyway, where do matters stand? Despite suffering catastrophic leadership losses, including the martyrdom of Supreme Leader Sayyid Ali Khamenei, top security official Ali Larijani, and multiple Revolutionary Guards commanders, Iran's political and military structures have not collapsed. If anything, Iran has managed to inflict significant losses on the US and its allies. Its asymmetric strategy in the war combines forward defense, what the Iranians call defy peshro, through regional allies, horizontal escalation to target Gulf energy infrastructure, decentralized military organization, what we term in military lingo as dispersal and delegation, to survive leadership losses and strategic reliance on Russian and Chinese ISR support. While its conventional forces are no match for US and Israeli firepower, Iran is fighting its own war and has effectively used its asymmetric toolkit to raise the cost of conflict, disrupt global energy markets, and demonstrate strategic resilience. What remains to be seen is whether this strategy ultimately succeeds, insofar as it will depend on whether the coalition can sustain military and economic pressure longer than Tehran can endure it. And this is where Professor Nasr comes in. Thank you so much, Vali, for taking the time out. If we just go back to January this year, on 23rd January, you and I were having lunch in Lahore, and the build-up had kind of begun. There was a lot of protests in Iran. We were discussing those protests. And we kind of talked about this question of whether there's going to be a war. And I remember that you and I were kind of 90 to 95% sure that there is a likelihood of a war. Now, I know my reasons for why I thought there's likely to be a war, but let's begin with why you thought there was likely to be a war, and then we're going to proceed and talk about what comes next.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ejaz, for inviting me to this program and also for your kind introduction. And you're correct, we go way, way back to the 1990s when we first met in Lahore. So it's very good to be back with you on this program. I think largely why war looked that it was coming in January when we met, first of all, was because the perception was, both in Israel and in Iran in particular, that the 12-day war that happened in June of 2025, when Israel attacked Iran with a view of essentially finishing it off, just in a very sort of dispassionate, cold and calculated way. The two countries had been rivals, essentially, in the Middle East. The tide had turned when Hezbollah collapsed, when Syria changed hands from being pro-Russian, pro-Iranian to being taken over by a Turkish-backed militia that then was supported by Saudi. Iran lost its footing in the Levant, and it was a clear pathway for Israel to attack an Iran that looked defenseless. And Israel, since October 7, has been in the mood to not just to defeat its enemies, but to actually destroy them completely, and sees an opportunity, sees American backing, has the military capability in its own view to do that. So it attacked Iran in June of 2025, not with the aim of just destroying its nuclear capability, which ultimately it couldn't do without American intervention because of the size of the bombs the Americans had, but to destroy the Islamic Republic. And that's why it started by decapitating 30 Revolutionary Guard commanders, nuclear scientists, and was hoping that there would be a popular uprising on the back of that attack. The war went on for 12 days. The US intervened. It bombed Iran's nuclear sites. And then there was a ceasefire on the 12th day, largely forced by President Trump. And the Islamic Republic was still standing. Despite the assassinations and the bombing, it didn't collapse. And in fact, Israel found during that war that Iran's missile capability was far more lethal than it had actually estimated before the war. So it actually found a new reason why it needed to defeat Iran. But the long and short of it is that the glass was half empty for Israel in June at the end of that war, and half full for Iran. And Israel had not achieved its war aims on June. And therefore, there was an assumption that the war would return. Now, the question was when. When would Israel be ready to go back to war with Iran? And it's still very enigmatic for us as to why this war happened a few weeks or a week after you and I met in Lahore in January. But the likelihood of it was quite high. And a lot of it also had to do with the perception in Washington and in Tel Aviv that Iran is weak. Not only because Hezbollah and Syria fell, but also the uprisings that happened in early January of 2026 started actually in December, but its most explosive point came January 8th, when I would say hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Iranians, over 200 cities came out. Economic grievances, political grievances, but it consolidated around an anti-Islamic Republic rally, chanting death to the dictator, end to the Islamic Republic. And the Islamic Republic had to resort to violent force that kills thousands of Iranians in 2 days in order to quell it. That was interpreted perhaps by President Trump, even more than Israel, that the Iranian regime was about to fall. And in fact, he first talked of a military intervention on January 9th, etc., saying that the Iranians should go take down the regime and help is on the way. America's locked and loaded to intervene. Now, United States usually doesn't intervene militarily to support human rights issues or democracy movements. This was clearly seen as an intervention to facilitate regime change. In the end, he didn't intervene at that point, but then the military card was already on the table that he might. And then, he began to move around with other reasons. So when he didn't intervene to bring about regime change, he went back to a nuclear argument, a nuclear issue which he himself had said was no longer relevant. So there was another round of diplomatic negotiations in Geneva, but all of it suggested that the U.S. was back to talking about a major intervention in Iran. And so that's why the war was likely to come at some point.
Yeah. A couple of points. The one, it seems, I want to get your take on this. It seems because now, obviously, there is a lot of evidence, and the Washington Post has reported this, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, that there was a December meeting between Netanyahu and Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and then a February meeting at the White House, where they had almost decided that they are going to war. It seems to me, on the basis of the nuts and bolts information that one has and President Trump's own statements, that Netanyahu managed to sell this to him on the basis that Iran is very weak at this point. Mm-hmm. And Trump thought that he could perhaps do a Venezuela 2.0, which is going to be a spectacular thing with the decapitation strikes, initial decapitation strikes and degradation, and that will be the end of it. And he did not realize the institutional depth which the Iranian regime can bring to bear on how it was going to respond. Hence, more than once, his surprise that Iran is still standing and that it has actually horizontally escalated the conflict. What do you think of that?
No, I think that is correct. There is also something here about the way decision making now happens in the Trump's United States. So what you mentioned exactly goes to the point that Israel was not satisfied with the outcome of the June war. It wanted to go back to war. The protest in early January perhaps came too soon, because the U.S. did not have sufficient firepower in the Persian Gulf or in the Mediterranean, and therefore they had to wait. So even Netanyahu advised that they wait until USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald Ford were in position. And the problem with Trump's decision making is that in the United States in the past, the system first identified the problem, whether it was a real problem or an illusory problem, like that Iraq is building nuclear weapons in 2003. But you first identify a problem. Then the system as a whole debates about how do you fix the problem? Is it diplomacy? Is it sanctions? Is it war? How urgent it is? And then you gradually, this sort of percolates up towards the White House, by which time you resolve gradually through an interagency process, as they call it, between the various branches of the government, and you arrive at a set of options for the president. Then you spend time not only to prepare, but also to socialize the idea with the American public, with media, with allies, basically lay out what your objectives are. None of this happened. There was never a discussion of what the problem is, why is it urgent, and the way in which Trump is influenced laterally by the level of people that are either heads of state, some of whom he pays more attention to than others, like Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman, Sheikh Tamim, or maybe a European leader here or there, or that there are the billionaires who have his ear. And in this case, a lot of the billionaires were also basically speaking on behalf of Bibi Netanyahu, who has a great deal of influence on them. So, and I don't know what Bibi told him. Perhaps Trump thought that this would be an easy war. that he would come out of this as the one American president since 1979 that solved the Iran issue, that the regime would fall. I think Netanyahu perhaps sold him on the idea that there is one man in Iran that is blocking anything happening, and his name is Sayyid Ali Khamenei. And if you remove him, the system will then open up. And I agree with you. I think the Venezuela model sort of besotted Trump. It went too easy, and he thought it's doable. I think Israel from the very beginning understood this would be a long war, because Israel is not after a nuclear deal or a missile deal. It wants to bring down the Islamic Republic, and I think preferably it wants to bring down the state in Iran. It wants an Iranian state that looks like Syria. Even if there is regime change, it would look like Syria, no military, internally divided. It wouldn't mind Iran becoming Libya, Syria, or Afghanistan, let's say, after the Soviets left, a country that is internally broken. And it's not a threat to Israel. It's not on its borders. And even if it were, Israel was far more threatened by Syria when it was under Assad and it was a coherent state than when it was in civil war, right? Yeah. And in fact, the greatest worry Israel has about Syria today, that it doesn't become a coherent state. So it wants it divided between Alawites, Kurds, Druze, no military, no capability, just internal. And so they knew this would take longer. Trump perhaps thought this might be a matter of a few days. Now, both of them were wrong in the sense that, first of all, as you mentioned, the Islamic Republic didn't fall. Secondly, the way the Israelis and Americans had calculated was that there is only one theater of war, and that's the missile corridor between Israel and Iran. In fact, that's why the USS Gerald Ford was parked on the Mediterranean, so that its missiles could basically serve as a booster of the Iron Dome. And so there were a few, if you would, surprises. And the Iranians had prepared themselves very well, and they had learned the lessons of the June War. So one, even in the June War, the way the Iranian state is organized is not top-down. It's like a mosaic. That's why you kill 30 commanders in June, and the military doesn't fall, and 24 hours later it starts fighting. Between June and January, or June and February, the system actually dispersed authority both within the military and the civilian government even further. It dispersed production and provision of food. It dispersed provision of electricity, fuel, etc. Iran has deliberately been built that way over 40 years under sanctions and fear of war, not to have a central point of collapse. Although every system does have it, but for Iran, the threshold is much, much higher. Secondly, the Iranians, like a boxer, like if some people in your audience or yourself remember the Muhammad Ali, George Foreman famous
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So Iran is Muhammad Ali. It went in believing that the other side wants to knock him out in 1 or 2 rounds. The name of the game is survive the first rounds. And then they calculated, I believe this, that they calculated that Israel and the United States had amassed enormous amount of offensive firepower, airplanes, Tomahawk missiles, various other missiles, but they were on short supply on interceptors and defensive missiles because they had not calculated a long war. And what you need to do is to absorb the hits and then launch missiles and drones at them to deplete their reserves. And they did this very successfully. For instance, the Gulf countries are now pretty much out of Patriot missiles. And then after the 15th day, it becomes much more even, because if Iran can sustain its launchers and preserve its missiles, then it basically can hit Israel or the Gulf countries with greater ease. And the US had never prepared for defending the Gulf. It was not even in its calculation. And then the third element of their strategy is the one you mentioned, which was basically choose the battlefield of their own choosing, not to fight on their American-Israeli battlefield. And the battlefield they chose is the global economy. First of all, going after, I would say, the oil facilities, traffic, Straits of Hormuz, varieties of pipelines, etc. Secondly, go after the Gulf economy as a whole, again, through the closing Strait of Hormuz to fertilizer, cooking oil, petrochemicals, etc., but also the entire services and trade industry globally that relies on Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. I mean, if you shut down the traffic that comes in and out of Jebel Ali port in Dubai, it log jams India and Southeast Asia's shipping. They're heavily dependent on that port. And I think also in time, so at the beginning, the attack on the Gulf was not personal. It's where, and also these countries had hosted the US. They had advanced radar systems, air bases from which the US attacked. And also the Iranians found out that despite what they had said publicly, that they would not allow the US to use their facilities, they were allowing the US to use their facilities. Now, I would also add that increasingly, Iran became committed to destroying UAE's economy. For the reason that, first of all, there's a 3-island dispute between UAE and Iran, which the UAE has been talking about much more now. Secondly, that UAE is an ally of Israel. The other countries in the Gulf are not. And thirdly, because the UAE has been much more actively supporting US operations. So in a way, the lateral, the escalation into the Gulf basically also has created this grave front for a country like Pakistan, which has a strategic partnership with Saudi. Its economy is also reliant in many ways on the Gulf, migrant workers, varieties of sorts of things. But the issue where the Iranians discovered in the Gulf is that they now have equal escalation capability as the US.
Absolutely.
So you hit, Israel hits Iran's gas field, we're going to hit Qatar's gas field. You hit Kharg Island, we're going to hit every single, refinery, oil production around the region, and there's nothing that the United States can do about it. In a way, it's been checkmated there. And Israel and the US keep bombing, and they're now going after infrastructure, etc. But the regime in Iran has remained resilient. And so long as it does, and its war-making capabilities intact, then it can keep going on. And I would add one other thing, is that the elimination of the leadership in Iran, people like Ali Khamenei, Larijani, and even the commanders that were killed in June, has eliminated the more prudent, restrained leaders. The ones that have taken their place are a very completely different breed. They actually believe that it was Khamenei's fault for being too soft in the past and responding to the US that brought war onto Iran. That Iran should have reacted much more aggressively going back to when the US left the JCPOA. And then I think the IRGC also essentially has reorganized itself as a guerrilla army. And that's one reason why it's very difficult to eliminate it. It's more of a partisan warfare. They've gone back to the way in which Hezbollah or during the Iran-Iraq war they fought. And so long as they can sustain this war, I think that President Trump can escalate, but the escalations will come at a heavy cost. I mean, taking Iranian territory, then you're putting American soldiers at risk, and then there might be more catastrophic impact on the global economy. I mean, right now, you could open the Suez Canal, and okay, you have a backlog that would take time to address. But if there's much more damage to oil and gas infrastructure in the region, it's going to take a much longer time period before that can be fixed.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we were talking about Strait of Hormuz. And this was like 5 or 6 days ago. I was on a television program and I said, no one is talking about Bab al-Mandab because Houthis are in the strategic reserve, and the Houthis are going to also enter the fray if they are required to do that. And as it happened, the very next day they announced that they are entering the fray. But you put so much on the table. Quickly, I mean, Klaus Liberts talked about Schwerpunkt, which is like the point of effort. If you disperse, if you delegate, if you have your Mosaic strategy, then there is no one point of effort. There's no one Schwerpunkt that can be that can be attacked. So it's been a fabulous strategy that way. But another thing that no one is really talking about, and I think that needs to be flagged, and I would like to get your take on this because I have written about this, that in the run-up to the war, if you recall, Al Jazeera had come up with the story about a 5-point proposal that was put forward by Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. And almost simultaneously, as this proposal was aired, Iran decided that it's going to move the venue of talks from Istanbul to Muscat. And that 5-point proposal was actually almost an expanded version of the demands, much more than just the nuclear file. So it appears, and I'm saying this on the basis of not just this 5-point proposal, but also some other evidence, that while the countries of the region did not want a war, they were going along with this US thinking that Iran has been weakened, and therefore this is the time to actually deprive Iran of its teeth. And that kind of, dovetailed with the, threat perception of the Gulf countries. But what they have finally got is the war. Mm-hmm. So their strategy and their calculation, from where I stand, seem to me was completely flawed. And, this entire business of bases and American support and the rest of it has become an albatross around their necks.
No, I agree with you. I mean, part of the problem with that initial effort in Istanbul, you would say it was countries like Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey have greater heft than Qatar or Oman do. But at the same time, there were two problems. One was that Iran did not want to end up in a situation where, even the countries around it would basically say, well, why don't you accept zero enrichment? Right? They're not. Pakistan obviously has the nuclear weapons, but the other ones could say, well, we're not enriching either. You accept zero enrichment as well. So they didn't want to be in a situation where the region would gang up on them. And therefore, they preferred Oman because, first of all, they trust the Omanis. Secondly, the Omanis are too small to gang up on anybody. Best thing they can do is to be good mediators or provide a facility, which they did. The other problem is that, and this is also a problem that to some extent at the beginning of this Pakistan faced, and that's why I'll come to it, why it's necessary to bring China in, is that partly these countries, the reason they can play this role is because their leaders have a special relationship with President Trump. They can talk to him directly. But when you talk to him directly, in order to bring the US to the table, to bring it halfway, they have to basically accept US premise of things. So they see themselves not approaching Washington as Iran's advocates or Iran's lawyer, but basically trying to find a way to split the middle, and therefore they have to protect their own relationship with Washington. I mean, imagine it would be very difficult for either Erdogan or let's say General Munir to actually talk to Trump and say, well, we believe that you should give this up and we're supporting Iran's position on this. It's not worth for Turkey or Pakistan at some level to ruin their own relationship with Washington or create an issue between themselves and Trump for Iran's sake, particularly because Turkey and Pakistan are extremely worried, but their neck is not as much on the line as that of Saudi Arabia and UAE. And secondly, countries like Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey, also behind the scenes, are being influenced hugely by the positions of Saudi Arabia and UAE as well. In fact, as we're speaking at the meeting that happened both in Riyadh and then in Islamabad, the Saudi foreign minister was also there. So he's not participating in this diplomatic process, but I'm sure his views are the views of the kingdom. I don't know exactly what they are, is also reflected, and Pakistan has to listen to that as well. But I think where we are seeing things with the Pakistani foreign minister going to China, what we're realizing is that what Iran now, after the war, now that the war has happened, what Iran is asking for essentially is that whatever deal there would be, that there would be a firm guarantee of A, that the deal would be implemented, and B, that there would be no more war on Iran by Israel and the US. And there's only one country, if there is any guarantee to be had, there's only one country that has the heft to basically try to provide that right now. And that's first is China, second is Russia. And so the Iranians would not think that even in the best of times that Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey are capable of guaranteeing that Trump or Bibi Netanyahu will not do what they did with JCPOA, or that attack Iran anyways, or they go home. Now they sort of lick their wounds, rebuild their arsenal, learn from where they were surprised by Iran this time, and be back at it in 6 months' time. Yeah. So the Iranians are looking, in my opinion, to bring China in a big way into the Middle East. They're talking, for instance, of that the Chinese should be a partner in management of the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah. In a way, I think at a larger level, what is gradually happening with what Iran is demanding is that the US is going to, at the end of this war, lose a lot of its influence and position in the Middle East. And the outside power that would probably take over that is China. And then you could say, not with Pakistan or Turkey so much, but with the Gulf and Saudis, now there's a huge issue of distrust between Iran and these countries. The US cannot serve as a bridge between Iran but China can. But China ultimately can basically do at a regional level what it did with Iran and Saudi Arabia 3 years ago in Beijing.
I was actually going to come to that because one aspect of that rapprochement and also the diplomacy that's happening currently, which is kind of not really being appreciated, is that in that rapprochement also, and this time also, Pakistan played a very significant role then in 2023, and Pakistan is again playing a very significant role this time. And in fact, right now, the way things are configured, Pakistan is the only state in the Muslim bloc which basically, despite being a majority Sunni state, also has the largest Shia population outside of Iran. And Pakistan's Shia population has historically and traditionally been socially upward mobile, they're highly educated, they're in the military and civil services, in other professions. So they are very influential in many ways. So it's the only country that actually can reach out across the Gulf. Gulf in both the literal sense and the metaphoric sense. And Iran trusts Pakistan. As a matter of fact, the Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson is on record as having said that the only country that stood with Iran is Pakistan. So I think Pakistan is using that space, both with Trump as well as with Iran, and certainly with China, to try and bring China in as a guarantor, because the United States cannot be a guarantor because the United States is the aggressor. And I think you're absolutely right that Iran actually wants, and the 5 demands that they've put forward, one of those demands is a framework for comprehensive peace. But let's move forward and talk briefly about this, flip-flop about ground incursion. Whether the ground incursion, so I talked about trumpery as the noun and as an adjective. So Trump's trumpery has been, we're sending the troops, or no, we aren't sending the troops. And so one doesn't really know, but there is a build-up again. Now, historically, because of Iran's formidable topography, Iran has allowed and is actually lured the enemy in and then finished him off. We saw that during the Iran-Iraq war. Um, so in the case of a ground incursion, it seems to me that there's going to be further escalation because the Iranians are going to make good on their promise that they will rain fire on the American Marines. If that happens, there are two possibilities. One is that the US tries to pull back. The other is that it tries to gamble for resurrection and double down. What is your assessment if that happens? How is the United States going to react to it?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult because this is not the United States. This is one man. I mean, in the end, when he says, I want to ground the invasion, the military doesn't say no. They say, yes, sir, and here are options to do it. I think, the issue that really resonates with Trump is the stock market and oil prices. And then, of course, it's the way he can spin the war. If there's a lot of body bags, a lot of Americans killed, etc., would become more complicated. Right now, I think his assumption is that there might be, one more push that then would allow him to force the Iranians to the table and claim victory. I think he's toying with the idea whether capturing an island, something like that, may do it. But you're right. I mean, first of all, not only could the United States then get ensnared in the cost of having to hold the territory. I mean, if they go in and take an island and then back away, well, that cannot be seen as any kind of victory, and it doesn't provide any leverage. If they go into an island or mainland Iran and try to hold territory, then there's going to be casualties, and it can become a much more prolonged war. Yeah. But also there is a possibility that the Iranians may actually do far more damage to the Gulf itself. And then as the U.S. is dealing with holding the territory and killing Iranians killing Americans, the war becoming messier. At the same time, you're going to have price of oil begin to go even higher and higher. Yeah. And so I think it's very clear right now that because this was ill-conceived, the whole thing was ill-conceived in Washington. There wasn't adequate preparation, economic and even military, in terms of building enough missiles, defensive missiles, etc., for a prolonged war, or preparing the Americans for why all of a sudden Iran became such an urgent issue. That their whole economy, etc., is being made a problem. Trump is already in a position right now that strategically he's been defeated. The question is, at what point can he snatch a victory out of the jaws of defeat? Now, he could always declare victory and leave, but the Iranians won't leave him alone, because the Iranians are not interested in ceasefire. They're interested in an actual deal that will end things. My own gut feeling is that he's not really, in his own mind, signed up for a prolonged war, that this war would define his presidency.
He did not.
He did not. And I think still his inclination, although you never know what goes on in his head, his inclination is to wrap this up. Okay, it's been a month. If it's wrapped up here, in a month's time, people can forget about it. Oil prices goes down. Still, most Americans have not become hugely focused on this issue. And the longer it persists, the worse it's going to become. And that's
Sorry. I just want to interject because I want to link this up with something that you said earlier. He did not sign up for a long war, but the Iranian strategy is to end the war by prolonging it. Now, he is in a quagmire. And unless Iran actually gets the other states, so given that Iran wants to end it by prolonging it, and Trump is in a quagmire, it's going to be very difficult for him to find that off ramp.
Very true. So this comes down to, like, let's say when he or J.D. Vance speak with General Munir, what are they offering? And then when General Munir relates this back to Iran, that's when the Iranians would realize that, okay, they have reached a point that now they can have serious conversation. The 15-point plan that was relayed by the United States to Pakistan, 14 points of which was made public by Israel, was a non-starter. That was pretty much what might have been there on the table in Geneva. Even there, it was not. It was a non-starter. So it basically was, you surrender everything, and then maybe we'll only lift some international sanctions and not even U.S. sanctions on you. So I think it has to be closer to what Iran is looking for, at least as a starting position. And then it's going to be, I think, some prolonged and tough negotiations that has to happen. So, it has to be a pathway that is very clear, that how does a ceasefire actually happen? And then how do you go from ceasefire to disengagement to something more lasting? So at the point where Trump is ready, it is what he conveys, let's say through Pakistan, in terms of what he's willing to talk about.
Yeah, but the problem is, I'm sorry, I'm pacing it up. The problem is that after the Turkey-Pakistan proposal for the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran, as concept of operations, had signed on, it took it there, and that very night, the Zionist entity attacked the nuclear facilities and the steel plant, and once again the entire thing fizzled out. But quickly, before we wrap this up, given all this, and let's just jump ahead of the curve, that there is a ceasefire, something happens, and this war ends. There has to be a strategic reset after what has happened within the Gulf, because the Gulf states' idea of securing themselves has been proven to be deeply flawed. So that reset, if they want peace and if they want investment, they will have to include Iran in that collective security arrangement rather than excluding Iran. What do you say to that?
No, I agree with you. I think the Gulf is right now in a shock. I think there is a lot of statements coming out of it, but this is in the heat of the moment, in the fog of war. Yeah. But you're absolutely correct. The security arrangement they live under for the past 40 years has proven to be a dead end. In other words, the United States invited war but didn't defend them. The United States has now created a far more aggressive, risk-taking, hardline Iran, much worse than the one that preceded it. And so the Gulf countries have to really rethink what does security mean and how to achieve it. Just having the U.S. bases again is not going to provide them security. Iran is now a threat, really. If you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, etc., you're angry at Iran for understandable reasons, and you also view Iran as a great mortal threat. But one of the key issues is that I think even the concept of GCC itself may no longer be relevant. In other words, I don't think all the Gulf countries would react the same way. We're already seeing Oman and Qatar going a different way. Kuwait maybe is more in the middle. And then you have Bahrain, UAE, and Saudi going a different way. And then even within that threesome, UAE and Bahrain, because they both have a treaty with Israel and are more vulnerable with Iran. Bahrain doesn't even have relations with Iran. Majority of its population is Shia. Its perception of an Iranian threat is very, very different, or in a very different place. And so we may see actually a fracturing, if you would, of the whole notion of GCC, because GCC was created essentially as a NATO against Iran, if you would.
Correct.
And now that the United States is no longer willing to or capable of providing the backbone to GCC, does the idea make sense other than the fact that they're all Arabs and they're all monarchies? Does it make sense for them to be a military alliance?
Yeah, but we saw, I mean, they started as partners in Yemen, Saudis, and the UAE, and ended up with a rupture. Mm-hmm. So, and you're absolutely right. UAE and Bahrain are separate cases, because right now in the region you have the three Mossad stations: Abu Dhabi, Baku, and Manama. So, and Iran knows that. So that's that. So when you talk about this possible potential rupture, three-way in the GCC, you think that those like Qatar and Oman are going to have better relations with Iran, also possibly Kuwait, and the others will kind of move away and have a separate kind of trilateral security arrangement or something?
Possibly. I mean, what the Iranians are already conveying to them is that a collective security is the best outcome. So you stop having US bases. We can basically share the Straits of Hormuz, share the Gulf in a way that we all have a stake in it. The Iranians want to bring the Chinese in to a greater extent as the guarantors of a relationship across the Gulf. Because you see, the US's presence was the guarantors of having no relations across the Gulf. In other words, we back you against Iran, whereas the Chinese inclination is to say, if you guys get together like Saudi Arabia and Iran did, we're happy to provide a guarantee for that. So I think the debate about the future of the Gulf will really start when the war ends. And then also it will greatly depend on what kind of an agreement Iran and the United States arrive at, because the Gulf is really holding its breath. You already are seeing UAE and Bahrain and possibly Kuwait and Saudi are all telling America, okay, you shouldn't have started this war, but now that you've started it, you cannot leave the Islamic Republic in place. You have to, quote unquote, go finish it off. Now, Trump doesn't look like he wants to finish it off because the cost would be on the US. But what sort of a deal ends up in place at the end will also be of great significance to how these countries would react to it. Would some of them defend that deal at the end, or would they view it as a threat to them? And so I think there's a lot of issues would depend on how this ends.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vali, for your insights. Lovely to have got you to talk to us. Our students will also watch it, and other viewers. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, do click on the subscribe button and give us feedback. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.
Thank you very much.